Hello, everyone. This afternoon, or early evening, I should say, I'm covering the last of our systems theory, and this involves the Mandalorian soundtrack. And so, what in the background, and to look at the systems level theory, it's kind of like some of the theories we looked at earlier in terms of balance of power theory and power transition theory, especially power transition theory, because what we have is a system for ascertaining who's going to be in charge of the international system and when major war breaks out. Now, as the story starts, if you look on slide 2, the hegemon is the dominant power in the international system. So, thus, if you say, all right, some groups got hegemony, means they dominate a particular system. The way, let's say, Duke basketball would dominate the ACC in collegiate basketball, or long ago UCLA used to dominate men's basketball. More recently, Connecticut would own women's basketball. But then often you have a challenger, a rising power in the international system. As the hegemon starts to weaken and the challenger grows in power, there's going to be a case where a challenger and a hegemon come to a head. Now, long cycle theory will tell you that not every time the challenger and the hegemon get together does it involve a violent confrontation. Sometimes it involves a battle. You'll see that with the red circle on the map. But in other cases, there's a non-violent confrontation. So what happens is, let's say you would say, well, why wouldn't you have a fight between the hegemon and the challenger? Well, usually there's a fight if the two groups don't have compatible views on how the world should be run. They don't agree with what the rules should be. And so what happens in these cases is, conflict breaks out. But let's say the hegemon and the challenger agree on the rules, they agree on the same ideologies, and they can sympathize with each other. A hegemon's getting exhausted, the challenger is going to take over. The hegemon allows the challenger to pass because that's the only way to keep your values in charge of the system. It's kind of like if you ever watch wrestling, it's like tag team wrestling where, the group that, or the wrestler that's in the ring is getting tired and they kind of allow their partner to do a tag team, slap the hand, and the new wrestler comes in fresh and ready for the fight, and the wrestler who's tired slips out of the ring. Now, sometimes the challenger fails to surpass the hegemon. The challenger gives it a good run. The hegemon may be declining, but hangs on to power, and the challenger is defeated. And as you'll see in the next 2 slides, how this has worked out over time. So our story begins, believe it or not long after 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You had 2 systems. Currently, Portugal was in the lead, and Spain was the rising power. So Portugal was the hegemon. Spain was challenging. But instead of a fight breaking out on the Iberian Peninsula between Portugal and Spain, the 2 of them came to an agreement where power would be shared. But this event, the Treaty de Tordesillas, would give Spain a lot of power in the world, and Portugal would recognize it wouldn't control the whole world. They would settle for half, or maybe less than half. And so Treaty de Tordesillas broke up the 2, or didn't break up, split the world into 2 possible empires, one for Spain, one for Portugal, that reflected Spain's new power. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. It's green, so why was it a peaceful one? Well, think of what Portugal and Spain have in common. I know nowadays they're going to say good soccer, but instead, what they also share in common, if you think about it, is they were both monarchies, and both were, wait for it, religion. Yes, they were both Catholic. And so this Treaty de Tordesillas, in fact, was negotiated by Pope Alexander VI. And so this would show that the world would still be in charge, would have a monarchical system, and a Catholic country would be in charge. So they weren't too concerned about Portugal would allow Spain to be the new hegemon because they knew that Catholicism would be the dominant value. Now that's not true when Spain and Britain come together in a battle. Whereas the Treaty de Tordesillas, 1494, Spain had a good run, but by about the 1580s, Britain is the rising power, and Spain feels their New World dominance with all that gold from the Americas. They're going to be challenged. Britain is a rising power. They want a piece of the action. And if you've ever seen a lot of pirate movies, especially Pirates of the Caribbean, you'll notice that there are a lot of British pirates or privateers taking on the Spanish in a series of naval battles. You had King Philip II was the strongest monarch, but Queen Elizabeth I was ready to challenge him. If you've ever seen those movies, they're pretty well done. About Elizabeth, and then again, Elizabeth the Golden Age, the sequel, is also good. Spain gets sick of these privateers or pirates, and they decide to send their whole fleet, known as the Armada, over to teach the British a lesson and crush their navy. But the British Navy has a couple advantages. The ships are smaller, they're more maneuverable. The Spanish ships are much bigger, laden full of troops and supplies, very slow moving. And the English have one more trick up their sleeve, in addition to great captains like Thomas Cavendish, Sir John Hawkins, and of course, Sir Francis Drake. They have one more trick up the sleeve. As the British ships are in position in the English Channel, the Spanish Armada is bearing down on them. The English sent out these fire ships where they set a couple of their older derelict boats on fire, and it broke up the Spanish Navy. They missed their destination to pick up the Spanish army in France, which was also Catholic, and it forced them out. The currents forced them out into the North Sea, where, let's put it this way, the storms are terrible. A roommate of mine from college, he and some buddies hopped a freighter from England to Denmark to Norway just to have some fun. And on the river, on the North Sea, they told me on this freighter boat, not a ferry, but it was a freighter that they hopped aboard. They were sick for weeks, afterwards, just because the rolling seas took them. Now, these are modern day tankers and freighters. Back then, the Spanish wooden ships, kind of burdened, and they would have like a kind of a high. Let's just say they're not really the most seaworthy crafts. They're more for picking up large numbers of troops and depositing them and holding lots of gold, but not very maneuverable. And a number of them sank in the North Sea and over by Ireland as they went around Britain and tried to get back home. That was the end of the Spanish supremacy. They never were the leaders again. And Britain won with smaller, more maneuverable ships, and they innovative plans like the fire ships, and they let the weather do the rest. So Britain had a good long run. Twice, France came close to challenging them in the 7 Years' War, in the Napoleonic Wars. France tried to knock Britain out for supremacy, but each time Britain was able to maintain power because of their navy. And if you guessed it, long cycle theory points out that the most military power, the most effective military power, is naval power. The 7 Years' War, the British fleet outperformed the French fleet. If you've ever heard of Lord Horatio Nelson and Trafalgar Square, it's to dedicate the biggest victory of the British Admiralty over Napoleon's fleet, just off the Spanish coast. Britain again was challenged in the early 1900s in a pair of world wars for world supremacy, or their hegemony, by Germany. But in World War I and World War II, Britain was able to hold off the Germans and maintain their hegemony in the international system. Oh, I apologize. In each of these cases where there was conflict, the British held different values from the Spanish, from the French, and the Germans. You can think about how Protestant British might be different, uh, how the constitutional monarchy of Britain might have differed from the Bourbon monarchy of France, as well as the Napoleonic Empire, and how Britain differed from Kaiser Wilhelm II, as well as Adolf Hitler's National Socialism. By then, Britain had morphed into more of a democracy. But as you shift over to slide 4, being on in charge or on top is pretty tough. And so what happened is there was a meeting in the early 1940s between FDR and Winston Churchill, the American and the British leader. They met out in Argentia Bay over on the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. And there, Britain pretty much said to the United States, we can't be the world's policeman anymore. We can't be the hegemon. We need you to step up and be the new hegemon to defend our values of democracy, of capitalism, and free trade. In the United States, they did the tag team thing again, and now the United States is the new dominant hegemon. We are challenged in the Cold War by the Soviet Union, which certainly doesn't share our values. But if you think about it, our Navy was always supreme to the Soviets. They may have had other advantages, but our submarines and our ships were far better, as well as other things. We had a better economic system to maintain that fleet as well. And so the United States was able to hold off the challenge from the USSR. But now we got to ask ourselves, what's going to happen over the next few years? Will the United States stay as the hegemon? Who will challenge us? China, the European Union, Japan, Russia? And not only that, with the United States, would we be surpassed or not? Which countries of those that we mentioned would we allow to be the new hegemon? Which ones of them would share enough of our values that we would accept new leadership, if that's what it came to? Might we cede power to Saudi Arabia if we had some general agreement about how things were to be done? So think about whether we might go through World War III or maybe a change in power in the World Trade Organization. Thank you very much for your patience. It was kind of dark out here, and as you know, I wear soccer jersey, so I'm wearing my Spanish Barcelona jersey in honor of when Spain was the hegemon. Hope you have a good evening, and I'll see you for the next set of slides.